You talk to your grandparents, and they tell you about how cheap cars and TVs and everything was in the 1950s and 60s. Today, everything feels so expensive. Your parents tell you they worked a single part-time job and they were able to put themselves through college. We know it's a little different than that today, right? The economic idea that this drives at is called price level. Another example of this, you finally finished that degree, you got your diploma in front of you, you're trying to decide which of these offers to take in different cities. You're offered a whole bunch of money to move to a big old city like New York, and you're offered a little bit less money to move to maybe a rural area in Kentucky, something like that. How do you compare? You know it costs more to live in the big city, rents are higher, things like this. But how do you want to compare apples to apples? How do you compare the cost of living in this city to a cost of living in another city? Or the cost of living today in 2020 against the cost of living 60 or 80 years ago? Or maybe eventually 20 years from now, right? The concept we're driving at here is price level. The cost of living. How expensive is it to buy all the stuff that you need to buy? The main measure that economists use for the price of living, for the cost of living and how it changes over time and space is the Consumer Price Index, CPI. The Consumer Price Index is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And how is it calculated? Well, it looks a little something like this. First, we send out surveys to all the people that they can get a hold of to figure out what do people buy? What do people buy? So they might buy, let's say, an apple. Let's say they buy an apple. So maybe they buy, I don't know, the average American household buying 10 apples a year, right? Well, now that we've surveyed everybody and we found out that they on average buy 10 apples a year, we store that in our information. We might say, okay, what else do they buy? What else? Oh, okay. Well, it seems like they buy some potatoes too, right? Maybe they buy 20 potatoes a year. So they buy 10 apples and 20 potatoes. We fix a market basket. We find out what the average consumer is buying, and then we use that information along with price information to find out how much it costs to live. Yeah, cost of living, how much it costs to live maybe. So we find out how much the apple costs in 2020. We find out how much the potato costs in 2020. Then we find it out again for 2021, 2022. And over time, we can compare how the cost of this market basket, the cost of all the things you have to buy to be living, right? Your cost of living, maybe. We calculate how much that costs and can compare it over time. So let's dive a little deeper into CPI and take a look at this together. All right, so there we have it, guys. Today we are going to be talking about price level, inflation, and the cost of living. I think you guys are going to find this very interesting. Today we're mostly going to focus on measuring these important variables and not the determinants, the things that cause these important variables to be the way they are. So let's dive right on in. So last week we saw, nominal and we saw real GDP, right? So nominal GDP allowed prices and quantities to vary, right? And real GDP only allowed quantities to vary. Said another way, real GDP took into account the effects of inflation, right? The effects of prices drifting over time, right? So we said GDP is essentially our national income. But what's so important is what can you buy with your income, right? So in order for us to understand what can we buy with our income, we're going to dive in, take a look at price level. Our best measurement is the Consumer Price Index, all right? It is a measure of the overall cost of the goods and services bought by a typical consumer. A measure of the overall cost of the goods and services bought by a typical consumer. All right. This is how we measure the cost of living here in the United States. This figure is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it is measured monthly. And it allows us to take into account, cost of living in different spaces and in different times, right? Especially across time. This is what so critical in the consumer price index. So how do we calculate it? Well, it looks a little something like this. First, we fix the basket. That was our apples and potatoes, right? We find out what are people buying and how many of each good are they buying. We do this through surveys, right? Then we find the prices. We look at market prices. How much does an apple cost? How much does a potato cost? We figure out all of our prices. Then we compute how much does the basket cost? How much does the basket cost? So we add up, so you want to take the apples per se, right? We find out how many apples are people going to buy. 10 apples a year? Okay, the average consumer gets 10 apples a year. Well, if it's 10 apples a year, we need to multiply that by the price. We'll say it was $1, and then we add that. Okay, so now price times quantity is $10, and then we need to add the same thing for potatoes. So price is maybe 50 cents. Quantity, everybody eats 40 apples, and $20 or $20 worth of potatoes, right? So we'll go through, we'll figure out what are people buying, how much does it cost, then we'll multiply price and quantity together to find out what we're spending on all these things, how much it costs to live, and then we turn it into an index, right? So we're going to divide how much the basket of goods and services, everything that people buy costs this year, divide that by what they costed last year, or whatever our base year is, right? And multiply that by 100. That'll give us our consumer price index, right? We can then use the consumer price index, again, a measure of price level, to calculate the inflation rate. So by determining the change, the percent change in the CPI, again, the CPI is the price level or the cost of living. By determining percent change, like we do down here at the bottom, in that CPI from 1 year to the next year, we can get a good measure of the inflation rate. The inflation rate is just percent change in the price level, right? How much in a given year are prices drifting upwards? And generally they do drift upwards. That's why we call it inflation. Occasionally they do drift downwards, and we would call that deflation, right? All right. So let's keep rolling along here. There are some other measures of price level and inflation, right? The one that is most talked about, most acclaimed, most economists would say this is a pretty good rival to the CPI as far as other potential measures of price level and inflation, is the GDP deflator. That's our big first one. We can calculate the GDP deflator by dividing nominal GDP by real GDP and multiplying by 100, right? So we find out, we allow prices and quantities to change, and then divide by just allowing quantities to change. So we're trying to isolate, the effect of price, right? Isolating the effect of price. That's what the GDP deflator is meant to do. It does take into account different things though, right? Instead of surveying people and finding out what they buy, we are accounting for differences in GDP. GDP measures what we produce, right? Our gross domestic product. And some of that is going to make, what do our individual consumers buy? It may fall to the wayside in GDP deflator, focusing more on what our domestic companies are buying. Maybe some of that we'll see, right? Core inflation is going to be CPI, the consumer price index, if we take out energy and food prices. Energy and food prices, they vary very dramatically, right? They go up and down all the time. I'm sure you guys are intimately familiar with the dance of gas prices and food prices flying up and down, right? So in order to get a better idea of what typical prices without these dramatic changes are doing, we look at core inflation. And lastly, the producer price index is essentially the same thing as the consumer price index. Instead of asking what our consumers, our customers, our general individuals in the public are buying, we ask what our domestic factories, our producers are buying, right? So here are a few different ways that we might choose to measure the inflation rate outside of our traditional use of the consumer price index. It's worth mentioning there are some issues that using CPI is not going to help us with. The first and potentially most important is the substitution bias. Whenever things become more expensive, we buy less of them. But as we said, the CPI goes out and surveys people and fixes a basket of goods. We figure out what do people buy, and then we find how does the price of the things that people buy change over time, right? Well, with substitution bias, the price of apples goes up a whole lot. Well, people aren't going to buy apples, but we still measure it as if people kept buying apples and didn't switch to oranges, right? Or switch to strawberries or whatever other substitute they might choose, right? So people substitute away from more expensive things. CPI is not going to pick that up, right? Introduction of new goods. So every year, our dollar is getting more valuable because we get this new broader amount of things that we get to pick from. We get new additional choices for what we want to buy, right? But these new goods are not picked up in our fixed basket, right? The diversity of choice that is available to us is not picked up, just price, right? Changes in quality, whether they are up or down, are not going to be measured. So I think the best example of really these last two bullets, introduction of new goods and unmeasured changes in qualities, is the television. Oh my goodness, televisions are insanely cheap today compared to what they were just 10, 20, or 30 years ago. Right now you can get like a 40-inch nice HD flat screen TV for what, 150, 200 bucks? That's a pretty common price you might see at your local Walmart. Years and years ago, you'd be paying much more. So 20 years ago, you'd pay much more, and it wouldn't be a flat screen, right? It'd have that weird curve, if you guys remember those kind of TVs, and it'd be much smaller and much heavier. So really a worse product being sold for more. We're missing that change in quality completely when we use the consumer price index, right? We're just focusing on price. Things like quality and our breadth of choice are going to be completely missed. And many economists also believe that CPI tends to overestimate inflation. Some economists prefer the GDP deflator, which estimates the estimates are usually a smidge lower. What does that look like? Well, it looks like this. We see the green line is CPI, the red line is GDP deflator. So we can see they move together. They look about the same most of the time, but generally GDP deflator is just a smidge lower than the CPI. They both calculate the inflation rate, different ways of measuring how price level is changing over time, right? The percent change in the price level. But we can see they move together, but GDP deflator is a smidge lower, right? So prices change over time. So if we want to compare, different dollar values as time passes, then we need to take into account the way that prices are changing, right? I think a great example of this comes directly out of the book. So how do salaries change over time, right? So we see the example from the book. Babe Ruth made $80,000 in 1931. Well, obviously, $80,000 was worth a whole lot more in 1931 than it is today. So how much is that $80,000 worth today? Well, we're going to need some things. We're going to need to know how much was earned. So that's that $80,000. And year T in this example is going to be 1931. And then we're going to need today's price level, and we're going to need the price level in year T, in this case 1931. Well, CPI is going to be our measure of price level. So CPI in 1931 was 15.2, so we'll plug that in right there. And CPI today is 237, and we'll plug that in right here. So let's take a look. Using this same formula, I just pulled this over. We plug in the $80,000, plug in the 237 divided by 15.2 to find that Babe Ruth earned just a little more than $1.2 million. Now, is this a lot of money? Well, $80,000 in a year in 1931, or $1.2 million in a year in in this case 15, we're accounting to 2015 dollars. Yeah, that's a lot of money to make in a year. But is this a lot of money to make in a year compared to other professional athletes? I don't think so. I'd say our modern baseball players are probably making quite a bit more, especially the best guys. The best guys are making an awful lot more than $1.2 million a year, right? And a lot of things can account for this. Well, how much did our preferences change? Do we like baseball more now? Do more people watch it now? These kind of things. Is it more marketable now? Can we sell more T-shirts now? These kinds of changes over time may also affect why we see Babe Ruth making a little less than today's ball players, right? What else do we have to change because of inflation? Well, we're going to have to engage in some indexation. So we want to write laws that we don't have to rewrite every year because the dollar value has changed, right? So we can write into the law that it needs to automatically correct every year for inflation. So say your Social Security payment in 2010 was $1,000 a month. Well, if we are going to account for inflation, we had roughly a 2% inflation rate that year. Well, then next year you need to make $1,020 a month, right? A 2% more next year. We need to account for this inflation. Otherwise, the dollar value of your Social Security payment in purchasing power terms, in ability to buy stuff, is going to keep falling, right? The dollar value, the value of your dollar is falling over time. That's what inflation is driving at, right? So indexation allows us to correct for this when we write contracts and when we write laws, right? Another good example is tax brackets. So if we didn't allow tax brackets to change, then over time people would make more money, and then the tax brackets wouldn't be charging people the same way that they are today, right? Because they are set at different dollar values, right? Okay, so another thing we need to keep in mind, real and nominal interest rates. So an interest rate is the rate of return you get on your money, right? Sometimes we receive interest rates when we deposit money into a bank. We get paid interest rates, and sometimes we pay interest rates. If somebody deposits money in us, maybe like a student loan or something like that, or a credit card, then we have to pay interest rates for the privilege of borrowing the money, right? And we can see that the real interest rate, real in this case just meaning that accounting for inflation, the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, right? So I may ask, is my traditional savings account actually really getting returns in the real world? Well, let's see. If I'm earning 2%, which would be a very high savings rate right now, interest rates are incredibly low. So if I'm earning 2% and the inflation rate is 3%, well, my nominal interest rate is 2%. 2% minus the inflation rate of 3%, that would be -1, right? -1% real interest rate. Well, what does that mean? That means every year the purchasing power of my dollar, or however much is in the bank, is falling by 1%, right? The purchasing power of what I have saved is falling every year. So why do we care so much about inflation rates? This is a really great example. If your inflation rates are super duper high, then your savers, those counting on interest rates, savings, often are elderly people living on their retirement. They may be trying to live on the return or on the growth of their money. Well, if inflation is super, super high, that may take away that growth and make it hard to live on that money. So maybe this is another example of why inflation matters so much and why price level matters so much. And it's worth mentioning here, part of the reason that I face this problem of my interest rate, my nominal interest rate at my bank not keeping up with the inflation rate, right, is that I'm using a traditional savings account. You guys should definitely be using, for your long-term investment, money that you want to grow. You shouldn't be using traditional savings accounts, and really certificates of deposits, things like this, your different things that they might offer you at a bank are not much better. So you really should be investing in mutual funds and financial products like this for your long-term investment portfolio. But if you want to know more about that, you'll have to talk to the folks over in finance. And I did want to hit this one more time. Price level varies geographically, right? So what I've got here are regional price parities by state. Essentially, this is trying to measure how the price level is different in different states of the union. So notice Washington, D.C. up at the top here. Purchasing power, or our regional price parity is 117. And the U.S. average is right at 100.2 with Vermont, right? So what does this mean? What am I looking at here, right? Well, what this means is for you to have the same purchasing power, for you to be able to buy all the same stuff in Vermont as you do in Washington, D.C., then you'd need to make, look at this here, 117% of what you make in Vermont. Said another way, 17% more. So if you make, I don't know, $100,000 to live in Vermont, well, if you want to be able to buy all the same amount of things in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., then you want to make another $17,000 a year. Well, how's this stack up compared to Kentucky? Well, Kentucky, down towards the bottom, 89.1 is our regional price parity. So essentially, you can buy as much stuff in Kentucky making 10% less than you might make at the U.S. average in a state like Vermont or Florida, which are very close to the U.S. average, right? So this variation in the price level geographically is going to be very important for you guys to keep in mind as you decide where you're going to be taking your next jobs, where you're going to be living. Keep in mind, just because you're making more in one state or in one city, maybe you're paying more in the cost of living, and you need to take into account that and try and make wise choices. Economics is all about making choices, weighing those benefits against those costs. I'll be honest, that's about all I got for today. So I'll see you guys next week as we keep on discussing more economics.